There are names that are given to you at birth, and there are names that are branded upon your soul. My given name is Claudette Jones, a name that once felt as simple and clean as a fresh page. But for more than 2 decades, I have lived under the shadow of another name, a name forged in betrayal and whispered like a curse, the Wretched Woman. That was the title my son's father and his family bestowed upon me, a venomous legacy they carefully fed to my only child, Damian. For years, I carried that label not like a piece of clothing that could be removed, but like a second skin, one that was scarred and tight and suffocating. It was the name I heard in the silence of my lonely nights, the name I saw reflected in the pitying eyes of strangers, the name I fought to scrub away with every fiber of my being. What Damian never knew, what the world never saw, was that the woman he was taught to despise, the woman they had left for dead, had not only survived the fire, she had learned to command the flames. The call that would shatter 2 decades of silence came on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The sky outside my office window was a canvas of bruised purple and soft gray, the city lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars on the 55th floor. The room around me was a testament to a life built in the quiet margins of society. The scent of aged leather from my chair, the soft glow of a banker's lamp on polished mahogany, the neat stacks of property deeds and investment portfolios all spoke a language of power and control. This was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, built brick by painstaking brick from the rubble of my former life. The phone on my desk, a sleek black rectangle, began to vibrate, its screen illuminating an unknown number. In my world, unknown numbers were rarely a surprise. They were usually business associates or legal counsel from different time zones. But this time, a strange stillness fell over the room. A tremor, not in the air but deep within my bones, a primal hum of recognition that blood sometimes sings to blood across any distance. Against all my carefully cultivated instincts, I answered. A voice, deeper and colder than I remembered, spoke my name first. Not mother, not mom, just Claudette. The single word was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's cut, intended to sever any notion of warmth or familiarity. My spine went rigid. My hand, which had been resting on a ledger, clenched into a fist. It had been more than 20 years, a lifetime ago, since I had last heard that voice crackling through puberty. Now it was the voice of a man, a stranger, yet it was so intrinsically familiar that a wave of cold dread washed over me. It's Damian. The world around me didn't just go still, it ceased to exist. For a single suspended moment, there was only the hollow echo of his name in my mind. Damian. The boy I had held, the boy I had sung to sleep, the boy whose face I had memorized from a distance through grainy photographs procured by private investigators. I had not heard his voice on any of the 20 birthdays that had passed in silence. Not on the holidays I spent staring at a phone that never rang. Not through the years I clawed my way up from nothing, my hands raw and my spirit weary. And certainly not during the nights I spent bargaining with God, wondering if he even remembered the cadence of my laughter or the feel of my hand in his. And now, here he was, slicing through the years as if they were nothing more than a thin veil of mist. "I'm getting married," he said, his tone flat, devoid of the joy one would expect. The words were not an offering, they were a statement of fact, a preamble to something else. There was no warmth, no hesitation, no hint of a son reaching out to a long-lost mother. My heart, a veteran of countless battles, braced itself. I said nothing. I waited, listening to the faint static on the line, a sound that seemed to mirror the static in my own soul. Then, the sneer I had been anticipating, the one I knew was coiled and ready, slithered down the line. "I'm sure you'll want to be there." It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as an invitation, and beneath it lay a trap. "I will finally have the chance to show everyone, in person, what I've been telling them about you for all these years." He paused, letting the venom steep. "The Wretched Woman. You'll sit there in whatever rags you manage to scrape together, and they will all see you for what you really are. A failure. A ghost. My living cautionary tale." His words hung in the air, heavy and thick with years of practiced hatred. He had polished this speech in his mind, rehearsed it, savored the cruelty of it. And if I had been the woman he imagined me to be, the woman his father had so carefully constructed for him, those words would have shattered me. They would have sent me spiraling back into the darkness, into the shame, into the silence they had built to contain me. I would have wept. I would have pleaded. I would have broken, just as he intended. But that Claudette, the one who flinched at shadows and wept into her pillow, had died a long, long time ago in a cold prison cell. She had been buried under years of relentless work, hardened by betrayal, and reborn in the fires of her own ambition. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, and a strange sensation bubbled up from my chest. It wasn't a sob, it wasn't a gasp of pain, it was a laugh. A low, quiet, steady laugh that held no mirth, only the cold, sharp glint of steel. It was a sound that carried more power than sorrow, more strategy than surrender. It was the sound of a queen recognizing checkmate 3 moves before her opponent even knew they were playing the same game. The sound of my laughter seemed to unnerve him. I could hear his breath catch on the other end of the line. This was not the reaction he had scripted. "I'll be there," I said, my voice simple, calm, and utterly devoid of the emotion he had hoped to provoke. Then, without another word, I ended the call. I placed the phone back on its cradle with a quiet, deliberate click. In that single, electrifying moment, I understood everything. Damian had not merely invited me to his wedding. He had, in his arrogant attempt to wound me, handed me the very stage I had spent 2 decades building in the shadows. For years, I had accumulated wealth, power, and influence with the silent patience of a predator. I never flaunted it. I never sought the limelight. My success was a secret garden, cultivated for my eyes only. I had often dreamed of the day Damian would see me, truly see me, not because I craved his approval, but because I yearned for the lies that had defined our relationship to finally die a swift and public death. And now, in his misguided quest for one final theatrical disgrace, he had arranged my grand entrance. He had sent out the invitations, gathered the audience, and set the scene. All I had to do was arrive. I leaned back in my leather chair, the fine material sighing under my weight. I stared out at the sprawling city skyline, a kingdom of glass and steel that glittered under the fading light. My reflection stared back at me from the polished window, and I saw not the face of a woman crushed by a cruel memory, but the face of a woman who had been sharpened by it. The lines around my eyes were not from sorrow, but from focus. The set of my jaw was not from tension, but from resolve. Damian thought he was summoning a ghost to haunt his celebration. He believed he was digging up a buried past to prove a point. He had no idea that instead, he had awakened a dragon. That day, in that quiet office high above the world that had once cast me out, I shed the last vestiges of the name they had given me. That day, I stopped being the wretched woman. That day, I became something far more dangerous. I became a mother with absolutely nothing left to lose, and an entire lifetime of truth left to prove. To understand the sound of that laugh, to comprehend the steel that lined my voice, you must walk with me back through time. You must step into the ghost of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. The woman who answered that phone call was forged in silence and strategy, but she was born from the ashes of a girl who knew only how to love and how to hope. I was not always Claudette Jones, the name whispered in boardrooms and associated with silent, decisive acquisitions. Once, I was just Claudette Miller, a girl from the east side of town, where the fences were a little more rusted and the dreams were a little more desperate. I believed in the simple arithmetic of hard work and good faith. I believed that love was a fortress, strong enough to withstand any storm. And when I married Howard Jones, I truly believed my hard days were finally behind me. Howard came from a family that carried their name like a title. The Joneses were not titans of industry, not by a long shot, but in our modest city, their trucking company, Jones & Son Logistics, afforded them a certain air of aristocracy. They lived in a sprawling brick house on the west side, a world away from my childhood duplex. They saw themselves as the bedrock of the community, and from the moment I entered their orbit, they never let me forget that I was merely a satellite, a foreign body pulled in by their son's inexplicable gravity. The first time I felt the full weight of their condescension was at my own wedding. I stood in a simple white dress, one I had saved for months to afford, feeling like a princess in a fairy tale. But the fairy tale shattered when I overheard Howard's mother, Eleanor, speaking to her sister in a stage whisper loud enough to be an announcement. "Look at her," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine poison. "She simply doesn't belong in this family." "She's trying, of course, but you can't polish a stone and expect to find a diamond." I felt the blood drain from my face. Howard, standing beside me, gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, but he said nothing. He smiled for the camera, deaf to the whispers that would soon become the soundtrack to our marriage. I brushed it off then, blinded by what I thought was unshakable love. What I didn't know was that those whispers were seeds, and in the fertile ground of the Jones family's pride, they would grow into a forest of lies that would eventually choke the life out of my name. When Damian was born, it was as if the sun had finally risen just for me. I poured every ounce of my being into motherhood. It was the one role where I felt truly competent, truly whole. While Howard was increasingly consumed by the family business, I was consumed by our son. I was not a perfect mother. No one is. But I was a present one. I was the one who knew the exact rhythm of his breathing when he had a fever, the one who could soothe his nightmares with a single song. I patched the knees of his jeans when he tore them playing in the yard and worked odd jobs, cleaning houses and waiting tables, to make sure there was always food on our table when Howard's hours were cut or a big contract fell through. I did it without complaint, because I believed that was what a family did. You carried each other. But in the cold, calculating eyes of Howard's family, none of my efforts mattered. They saw my part-time jobs not as a contribution, but as an embarrassment. They saw my humble origins as a permanent stain on their son's reputation. I was a burden, a millstone dragging their precious Howard down. They would visit our home, and Eleanor would run a finger over a dusty shelf with a sigh, a silent judgment on my housekeeping. His father would talk about business at the dinner table, pointedly directing his questions and comments only to Howard, as if I were a piece of furniture, incapable of understanding their complex world of logistics and finance. The breaking point, the moment the cracks in our foundation finally gave way, came during the financial collapse of the early 2000s. Howard's small business, which he had inherited, was struggling. He had made a series of poor decisions, borrowing money from lenders with predatory terms and cutting corners on bookkeeping to maintain the illusion of success. He was a man drowning in the legacy his father had built, too proud to admit he was failing. When the auditors and then the authorities began to circle, the Jones family didn't rally to support their son. They moved to protect their name. And to do that, they needed a scapegoat. They needed someone disposable. They needed me. It happened so fast it felt like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. They convened a family meeting, one to which I was not invited. From the fragments I overheard, from the cold, averted gazes of my husband, I pieced together their monstrous strategy. They would paint me as the mastermind behind the financial mess. I, the woman who balanced our household checkbook to the penny, was suddenly recast as a cunning embezzler. I was accused of forging Howard's signature on loan documents I had never seen, of siphoning money from company accounts I never had access to. It was a fiction so audacious, so cruel, that I couldn't believe anyone would take it seriously. But I had underestimated their influence and their utter lack of morality. Howard, the man I had built a life with, the father of my child, the man who had promised to love and protect me, stood silent. He watched as his parents and their lawyers meticulously crafted a narrative that would send me to prison and absolve him of all responsibility. He didn't defend me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even meet my gaze as I pleaded with him, my voice raw with disbelief. He just stood there, a hollow man propped up by his family's lies, and let them twist the knife. He let them sacrifice me to save himself. I will never forget the day they came for me. The morning light was streaming through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I was making Damian his favorite breakfast, pancakes with chocolate chips. He was only 5 years old, a whirlwind of energy and laughter. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, my world ended. 2 police officers, a man and a woman, stood on my doorstep. Their faces were grim, their presence an immediate violation of the sanctity of my home. They said my name, they said the words fraud and embezzlement, and then they produced a pair of handcuffs. The sound of the metal ratcheting shut around my wrists is a sound that has never left me. It was the sound of my life being irrevocably broken. Damian, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the hallway. He clutched the frame of the doorway, his small face a mask of confusion and terror. "Mommy?" he cried out, his voice small and trembling. I tried to speak, to reassure him, but a sob choked the words in my throat. I screamed his name, a primal guttural sound of a mother being torn from her child. "Damian!" I screamed it until my voice broke, until my lungs burned. But Howard's mother, Eleanor, who had appeared as if from nowhere, stepped in front of him. She pulled him back, her hand covering his ears, shielding him as if the very sound of my voice was a poison that could infect him. In that single horrific moment, I was no longer Claudette the mother, no longer Claudette the wife. In their eyes, and soon in the eyes of my son, I was the wretched woman they needed me to be. The courtroom was just a formality, a piece of theater designed to legitimize a foregone conclusion. The Jones family's connections, their high-priced lawyer, and Howard's devastating silence sealed my fate. He took the stand and spoke of his trust in me, of how I handled some of the household finances, words that were twisted by the prosecution to sound like a confession of my control over his business affairs. He never said I was guilty, but his carefully worded omissions painted a far more damning picture than any accusation could have. He looked not at me but at his father, as he spoke the words that would send me away. I was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary, and with the sharp, indifferent slam of a gavel, everything I had ever loved was stripped away from me. My son, my home, my name. Damian was handed fully into Howard's care, to be raised by the very people who had orchestrated his mother's downfall. I became a ghost in my own son's life, a story he would be told over and over again until it became his truth. A name spat like dirt whenever he asked why his mother was not there. They told him I had chosen money over him, that I had abandoned my family for a life of crime. The worst part, the part that sliced deeper than any prison shiv, is that he believed them. And in the silence of my cell, I began to understand that the bars of steel around me were the lesser of my 2 prisons. The greater prison was knowing that my son was being raised to hate the very memory of me. That was a sentence with no hope of parole. The first year in prison is not measured in days or weeks, but in moments of gut-wrenching realization. The clanging of the steel gates behind me was the first. The surrendering of my clothes for a coarse, ill-fitting jumpsuit was the second. But the moment that truly broke me came on a cold Sunday in May, my first Mother's Day behind bars. I had spent the weeks leading up to it clinging to a foolish, desperate hope. Maybe Howard, in some forgotten corner of his conscience, would let Damian send me a drawing. A simple card with his name scrawled in crayon. Anything to prove that I hadn't been completely erased. I watched the other women in my cell block, their faces a mixture of anticipation and dread. Mail call on Mother's Day was the most sacred and brutal ritual in the entire facility. For some, it brought tears of joy, a precious connection to the world outside. For most, it brought only a stark reminder of what they had lost. I waited. I told myself not to expect anything, but the hope was a stubborn weed, pushing its way through the cracks of my despair. The guard walked down the row, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. He called out names, handing over envelopes that were clutched like holy relics. He passed my cell without a word. I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, if there was anything for Claudette Jones. He glanced at his clipboard, his expression indifferent. Nothing today, Jones. I told myself it was a mistake. The mail was slow. Maybe it would come tomorrow. The next day I asked again, and the day after that. By the end of the week, the truth had settled in, cold and heavy as a tombstone. There would be no card. There would be no call. There would be nothing. The next year, I stopped asking. I learned to school my features into a mask of neutrality as other women wept over handmade cards and blurry photographs of their children. I became a ghost at my own grieving. My son had been taught that I no longer existed, and on the one day a year dedicated to mothers, I felt that non-existence most acutely. I tried to fight against the erasure. In the beginning, I wrote letters. I poured my heart onto thin, state-issued paper with a shaking hand. I wrote about my love for him, about the silly songs we used to sing, about how I thought of him every second of every day. I tried to explain what had happened in the simplest terms a child might understand, telling him that Mommy had been sent to a timeout by some very mistaken adults, but that I would be home soon. I sealed each letter with a prayer. Most of those letters, I later learned, never even left the prison mailroom. Howard's family had used their influence to ensure my voice would be silenced completely. The few that might have slipped through the net were likely intercepted, torn to shreds before they could ever reach his hands. I imagined Damian seeing my handwriting on an envelope, a flicker of a memory, and then his grandmother snatching it away, telling him it was from that wretched woman, a bad person he must forget. And I knew he would believe her. Why wouldn't he? She was there, and I was not. Every scrap of information I gleaned about his life came to me secondhand, smuggled in through the prison grapevine. A new inmate whose cousin lived in my old neighborhood would mention seeing a boy who matched Damian's description. I heard he was excelling in school, that he had a powerful arm for baseball. I heard he had a smile that was the spitting image of mine, though he would never know it. The most painful piece of news came during my 3rd year inside. I heard he had started calling another woman Mom. It was Howard's new girlfriend, a woman chosen, I was sure, for her placid demeanor and her lack of a past. Each of these stories was both a dagger and a balm. A dagger because it reminded me of the life I was missing, the milestones I would never witness. A balm because, despite everything, my son was thriving. He was healthy, he was safe. And a part of me, the mother part that transcended my own pain, was profoundly grateful for that, even if it meant my own heart had to be collateral damage. The years in prison grind you down. They strip away your identity layer by layer until all that's left is your inmate number and your regrets. You learn to navigate a world with its own brutal set of rules, a world where a misplaced glance can lead to a fight, and a moment of weakness can make you a target. I saw women crumble under the weight of it all. Some sought solace in contraband drugs, their eyes growing vacant and dull. Others carved lines into their own skin, desperate to feel something, anything, other than the crushing emptiness of their existence. I had my own moments of despair, nights where I lay on my thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, convinced I would not survive. But I had something that many of them did not. I had rage. It was a clean, pure, incandescent rage. Rage at Howard for his cowardice. Rage at his family for their calculated cruelty. And, in my darkest moments, a bitter rage at Damian for believing their lies so completely. That rage became my fuel. It kept me warm on the coldest nights. It gave me a reason to get out of my bunk every morning. I would not let them win. I would not let their narrative be the final word on my life. I began to use my time. Instead of letting my mind atrophy, I worked. I took every class the prison offered, from basic accounting to business management. I spent every spare moment in the prison library, devouring books on finance, real estate, and entrepreneurship. The other inmates would mock me, calling me the professor, but I didn't care. Knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take from me. It was the one currency that had value both inside and outside these walls. I filled notebooks with plans, with ideas, with the blueprint for a future they had tried to steal from me. My estrangement from Damian was a wall built brick by brick, lie by lie, silence by silence. And I understood that when I was finally released, that wall would not simply crumble. It would be higher and more formidable than any prison gate. By the time my sentence ended, I walked out of those gates a different woman. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, a few dollars in gate money, and a heart that had been taught the brutal lesson of expecting nothing from the son I had lost. But deep within me, buried beneath the pain and the shame, a quiet vow had taken root. They had called me wretched, erased me, and left me for dead. But prison would not be the final chapter of my story. It would be the prologue to my revenge. The day I walked out of prison, the sky seemed impossibly wide, the air so sharp and sweet it almost hurt to breathe it in. Freedom, I discovered, is a terrifying thing when you have nowhere to go and no one to call. Howard didn't come. Damian didn't come. I stood alone on the gravel shoulder of the road, the prison gates looming behind me, a concrete and steel reminder of the 5 years that had been stolen. The state gave me a bus ticket to the city and $40. That was the price they put on my freedom, the cost of a life derailed. I took the bus and rented a bed in a halfway house, a grim, cheerless place where the walls were paper thin and the smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of despair. Every morning I would set out with a list of job openings, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I learned very quickly what it meant to be a felon. I learned the precise moment when a potential employer's smile would vanish. It was the moment they reached the box on the application that asked, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" I would tick the box for yes, and just like that, the interview would be over. So, I took what I could get. I scrubbed toilets in grimy motels on the edge of town, where the guests never made eye contact. I flipped burgers in a greasy spoon diner until my back screamed in protest. I worked as a janitor, pushing a mop down the long, empty hallways of office buildings after everyone else had gone home. The silence of those nights was immense, a vast, echoing void that I filled by humming to myself, just to remember the sound of a human voice. It was not a life of dignity, but it was a life of survival. And every dollar I earned, every single penny, was a victory. While the other women at the halfway house spent their meager earnings on cheap liquor or fleeting comforts, I saved. I sat under the flickering fluorescent light of the public library, not for warmth, but for knowledge. I continued my education, reading everything I could get my hands on. I taught myself about stock market trends, about real estate investment trusts, about the intricacies of contract law. I filled notebooks with handwritten notes, memorizing terms I barely understood, telling myself that this knowledge was the key that would one day unlock a better life. Shame was a constant companion, a shadow that followed me everywhere. At the bus stop, I would hear neighbors whispering my name when they recognized me from the old newspaper clippings. At the grocery store, a cashier would mutter, "That's her," under her breath. To them, I would always be the wretched woman who went to prison, the mother who abandoned her child. I refused to let it break me. I learned to hold my head high, to meet their stares with a calm, unwavering gaze that offered no apology. I saved every penny with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I stopped buying coffee. I walked for miles instead of paying for the bus. I wore the same 3 shirts until the fabric was thin and the seams began to fray. Slowly, painstakingly, I scraped together a small nest egg. The day I had enough to move out of the halfway house and into a tiny one-room apartment was the first time I had cried since my sentencing. They were not tears of joy, but tears of quiet, profound relief. The simple act of turning a key in a lock that was mine, closing a door on a space that belonged to me, was a reclamation of my own humanity. There were nights in that small room when the loneliness was a physical presence, pressing down on my chest until I thought my ribs would crack. But every time the despair threatened to overwhelm me, I would repeat my mantra: they left me for dead. If I quit now, they win. If I rise, they lose. It was in those quiet, grinding years, when nobody was watching, that the foundation for my empire was laid. Survival was only the first step. One day, survival would become success. And success, I promised myself, would be the loudest and most undeniable truth of all. The catalyst for my transformation didn't come from a grand epiphany or a lucky break. It arrived in the form of a hushed conversation, overheard in the dead of night. I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain from the plush carpet in the executive break room of a downtown law firm. It was well past midnight, and the building was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and my own rhythmic breathing. 2 young paralegals, working late on a big case, walked in, their voices echoing in the empty space. They were not talking about their work, but about their weekend plans. One of them was bragging. "I rented out my spare bedroom on this new website, Airbnb," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "I made enough in one weekend to cover half my month's rent." The other one gasped. "Half your rent? In 2 days?" The first one laughed. "I know, right? It's like printing money." I froze, my scrub brush hovering over the stain. Half a month's rent, in a weekend. For me at that time, that was more than a week's wages earned through back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. The name of the website echoed in my mind. Airbnb. That night, I didn't go straight back to my tiny apartment. I went to the 24-hour library on the other side of town and used one of their public computers. My fingers, stiff and sore from scrubbing, fumbled with the keyboard as I typed in the name. The concept I discovered was deceptively simple. List a spare room, a couch, or an entire apartment, and host travelers for a fee. It sounded too good to be true, a world away from my reality. Who would possibly want to pay to stay in my cramped, drafty one-room apartment in a rundown part of the city? It was furnished with mismatched items I had salvaged from the curb, and the window looked out onto a brick wall. But desperation is a powerful motivator, and it has a close cousin named curiosity. I had nothing to lose. The next day, on my lunch break, I borrowed a digital camera from a coworker at the diner, telling her I wanted to take pictures of the city park. I went home and cleaned my small apartment until it gleamed. I scrubbed the floors, washed the single window, and fluffed the lumpy pillows on my bed. I took pictures from every conceivable angle, using the soft afternoon light to make the small space look as warm and inviting as possible. I wrote a listing: highlighting its proximity to a bus line and its quiet, if uninspiring, view. I priced it ridiculously low, a fraction of what the paralegal had likely charged, thinking that if I was lucky, I might get a single booking a month. To my utter astonishment, within 3 days I had my first reservation. A young couple, driving cross-country, just needed a place to sleep for one night. I spent the day in a state of nervous terror. I bought new sheets, a luxury I hadn't afforded myself in years. I even bought a single fresh flower and put it in a glass on the small bedside table. That night, I slept on a pile of blankets in the corner of the room, listening to the sound of strangers breathing in my bed. They left early the next morning, pressing a wad of cash into my hand and thanking me for my hospitality. After they were gone, I stood in the middle of my room, staring at the money. It was more than I had hoped for. A few days later, they left me a glowing 5-star review online. That one weekend, that single transaction, changed the entire trajectory of my life. It was as if a door had creaked open in a room I thought was sealed shut. From that moment on, I no longer saw my apartment as just a box I lived in. I saw it as an asset. It was my first piece of capital. I became obsessed with optimizing it. I scoured thrift stores and flea markets for secondhand decor, a colorful rug, a small painting, anything to add a touch of personality. I learned how to use descriptive language in my listing, painting a picture of a cozy, authentic urban experience. The bookings started to trickle in, then they became a steady stream. The cash that I earned was not for me. I did not spend it on better food or new clothes. I lived as frugally as ever. Every single dollar I earned from hosting went into a separate bank account, an account I labeled the future. When my lease was up for renewal, I didn't renew it. Instead, I found a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a slightly better but still affordable neighborhood. I moved all my sparse belongings into the smaller of the 2 bedrooms and listed the larger master bedroom full-time on the platform. My new neighbors thought I was insane, letting a constant parade of strangers into my home. But I saw the bigger picture. Each traveler who stayed with me was a stepping stone. Each positive review was another brick in the foundation of my new life. I hustled harder than I ever had before. My life became a relentless cycle of work. I would work my cleaning job in the early mornings, then my diner shift during the day. At night, I would come home, greet my guests, and then spend hours on the library computer managing my bookings, responding to inquiries, and studying the market. I learned the art of hospitality, leaving small welcome notes and a map of the city for my guests. I learned basic photography tricks to make my rooms look brighter and more spacious online. I stretched myself so thin I felt I might snap. There were days I operated on 3 hours of sleep, my body aching and my mind numb with exhaustion. My hands were perpetually raw from cleaning chemicals, and my back was a constant, dull throb. But every time a payment notification hit my email, it was like a jolt of adrenaline. It was proof that my plan was working. The tide was turning. Within 2 years, a time frame that felt like a decade, I had saved enough money to make my first major move. I didn't buy a property. I couldn't. My criminal record made getting a loan impossible. But I could rent. I found a small, run-down 3-bedroom house for rent, convincing the landlord to give me a long-term lease. I furnished it piece by piece with secondhand furniture, and I listed the entire house on Airbnb. It was a massive gamble. The monthly rent was more than I had ever paid for anything in my life. But my instincts, honed by years of studying the market, told me it would work. And it did. The house was booked solid. Then I rented another. And another. Before I knew it, I was no longer just surviving off the platform. I was running a business. My secret savings account, which had started with pennies, now held tens of thousands of dollars. For the first time since before my arrest, I felt a sense of power. It was not a power over anyone else, but a power over my own destiny. I no longer waited for a manager to approve my application. I no longer cared about the whispers of strangers. Each booking, each glowing review, each month of steady, growing profit was an irrefutable testament to the fact that the wretched woman was wretched no more. I told no one. Not Howard. Not Damian. My success was a secret I guarded with my life. To them, I was still invisible, still the ghost they had created. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I wanted to grow in the dark, to build my empire in silence. I wanted to rise so high in the shadows that one day, when the time was right, my success would be so blindingly obvious they could no longer ignore it. That day was still a long way off, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could feel it drawing closer. I had cracked open the door to a new life, and nothing, not shame, not fatigue, and not the deep, aching scars of the past, was going to stop me from walking through it. Time has a way of compressing when you are consumed by a single purpose. The years that followed were a blur of calculated risks and relentless work. One property became two became four became a portfolio. Before I realized the scale of what I was building, I was managing a small empire of short-term rental properties, first across the city, then across the state, and eventually across the country. What had begun as a desperate gamble with a single shabby room had morphed into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, an empire I orchestrated entirely from the shadows. I learned a crucial lesson early on. In the world of business, for a woman like me, visibility was a liability. A black woman with a felony record was not supposed to succeed in the cutthroat world of real estate. Banks would not lend to me, investors would not listen to me, competitors would not take me seriously. And I used their prejudice as my shield. Their doubt was my camouflage. I built my entire operation under the radar. I established a series of limited liability companies, or LLCs, with innocuous names, each one holding a piece of my portfolio. I found a trusted business partner, a retired accountant who believed in me, to be the public face of the operation when necessary. When people searched for Claudette Jones, all they found was the ghost of a woman from a 20-year-old newspaper article, a footnote in a local scandal. Behind the curtain, however, I was the one pulling every string. I reinvested every single dollar of profit, snapping up distressed properties that others overlooked. I saw potential in the boarded-up houses and the neglected apartment buildings. I learned to read market cycles, to master zoning laws, and to build a quiet network of loyal contractors who respected my discipline and my prompt payments. To them, I was not a felon. I was the woman who kept her word and whose checks never bounced. I never flaunted my growing wealth. I lived in a modest apartment, drove a sensible car, and wore simple, unassuming clothes. This wasn't about the trappings of success. This was about building a fortress, stone by stone, so that when the day of reckoning came, I would be unassailable. By my mid-50s, I held deeds in cities that Howard and his family had probably only seen on a map: Chicago, Atlanta, Houston. A sprawling portfolio that generated a passive income so significant that I could have stopped working forever. But I didn't. The work was no longer about survival, it was about redemption. Yet, even in the cocoon of my success, Damian haunted me. He was a phantom limb, an ache for something that had been severed but was still profoundly felt. I could be walking through the opulent lobby of a 5-star hotel I now owned, dressed in a suit that cost more than I once made in a year, and the sight of a young man with a similar build, a similar way of tilting his head, would steal my breath. Suddenly, I would be right back in that doorway, watching my 5-year-old son crying for me as they dragged me away. I told myself I had moved on, that my empire was proof enough that I no longer needed his acknowledgement. But blood has a way of tugging at the heart, even when it's been poisoned by lies. I hired a discreet private investigator, not to interfere, but simply to know. I knew the college he graduated from, the company where he built his career, the kind of car he drove. I even knew the name of the woman he was serious about, Vanessa. Sometimes, on lonely nights, I would drive through his affluent suburban neighborhood. I would park my unremarkable car down the street and just watch the warm lights glowing in the windows of his house. I never got out. I never knocked. I just sat in the darkness, a ghost watching a life she was never allowed to be a part of. I wondered if he hated me as much as I feared, or if, even worse, he simply never thought of me at all. It was during one of these moments of quiet pain that the voice of my Aunt Louisa, the only family member who had ever stood by me, would echo in my ear. She was older, with a tongue as sharp as a razor but a heart as soft as worn cotton. "Child," she had told me once, her hand covering mine across her worn kitchen table. "You've built all this, but you are still a prisoner. You are still chained to the memory of a boy who doesn't even speak your name. The proving is done, Claudette. You've already proven them all wrong. Now it's time to prove it to yourself." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Not yet. Because every night, when I closed my eyes, I saw Damian standing at an altar, and I saw myself walking into that room, not as a guest, but as a reckoning. Aunt Louisa urged me to find peace. But the ghost of my son was everywhere. He was the silent question mark at the end of every success. And his ghost was driving me, not towards peace, but towards a confrontation that I now knew was as inevitable as the rising of the Sunday. The weeks leading up to the wedding were not filled with anxiety, but with the calm, methodical precision of a general preparing for a decisive battle. Damian's contemptuous invitation was not an insult, it was an opening. He had unwittingly provided me with the perfect theater for the truth. He wanted me to be a spectacle of ruin, a living embodiment of the cautionary tale he had been fed his entire life. He envisioned me shuffling in, stooped and ashamed, a relic of a past he had successfully overcome. He had no idea he was inviting a queen to his coronation, a queen who had every intention of claiming the throne. My preparations were swift and silent. My first call was to my head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus, whose stoicism was legendary. His presence alone commanded respect. "I need 2 of your best men," I told him, my voice even. "Not guards, protectors. I need an aura of untouchable authority." He didn't ask for a reason. He understood that my requests were never born of vanity, but of strategy. Next, I addressed the matter of my arrival. It had to be more than an entrance. It had to be a statement. I didn't just order a car, I commissioned a presence. A Rolls-Royce Ghost, the color of polished silver, a machine that didn't so much drive as it glided, a silent, powerful apparition. The symbolism was deliberate. I was the ghost of Damian's past, returning not as a haunting memory, but as an undeniable corporeal force he could not ignore. Then came the armor. I didn't go to a department store. I visited a private couturier in a discreet downtown studio, a woman who had dressed first ladies and titans of industry. I described to her not what I wanted to wear, but what I wanted to convey. "Power," she murmured, her measuring tape moving with expert grace. Unapologetic, unassailable power. We chose a tailored suit in a deep navy blue, the color of the midnight sky. The fabric was heavy silk, the lines so sharp and clean they looked as if they could cut glass. It was paired with a simple silk shell, the color of cream, and a pair of heels high enough to command a room but solid enough to stand my ground. The final piece was a necklace, a single strand of South Sea pearls, each one perfectly round and luminous. They were not flashy, they were not ostentatious. They were simply, unmistakably, real. They rested against my collarbone, a quiet testament to a wealth that didn't need to shout. The woman he thought he had buried would not be wearing rags. She would be dressed in the spoils of a war he never even knew she was fighting. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky of brilliant, unnerving clarity. The air was still and warm, pregnant with unspoken tension. As the silver ghost turned into the long, winding driveway of the opulent country club, I could see them, the guests. They were scattered across the manicured lawns like brightly colored flowers, sipping champagne, their laughter tinkling in the afternoon Sunday. The quiet, throaty hum of the Rolls-Royce's engine turned heads long before the car came into view. It was a sound that did not belong in their predictable world of leased Mercedes and BMWs. As we glided to a stop before the grand entrance, whispers rippled through the crowd. Who was this? A governor? A celebrity? Their minds scrambled to place the importance of such an arrival. They were not expecting me. The driver opened my door. One of my protectors, a man built like a monument, stepped out first. He scanned the crowd, his gaze neutral but absolute, silencing the nearest cluster of guests. The second man took up a position on the other side. Then, slowly, deliberately, I emerged. I placed one navy-heeled foot onto the pristine cobblestone, and the atmosphere shifted. The sunlight caught the luster of the pearls at my throat. I rose to my full height, my posture straight, my chin held high. For the first time in over 20 years, I was not Claudette Jones, the ex-convict, not the wretched woman, not the ghost. I was Claudette Jones, the architect of my own resurrection. A collective, audible gasp moved through the crowd. I saw the bride's family, strangers to me, smile with polite curiosity, assuming I was a guest of honor they hadn't been told about. But on the other side of the lawn, among the Joneses, recognition dawned like a slow, dawning horror. I saw the sharp intake of breath from Howard. His face, puffy and florid from years of comfortable living, turned an ugly, mottled shade of red. His mouth fell open, a silent O of disbelief. He looked as if he had seen an actual specter from the grave. And then my eyes found Damian. He was standing near the archway where he would soon be married, a champagne flute in his hand, a smug, confident smile on his face. He turned, following the gaze of his guests, and his eyes locked onto mine. The transformation was instantaneous and catastrophic. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, ashen gray. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. His knees seemed to buckle, his free hand shooting out to grip the back of a nearby chair for support. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone patio with a sound that seemed to slice through the festive music. This was not the broken, pathetic creature he had summoned for his own amusement. This was not the woman he had prepared for. He had expected a footnote. He was being confronted with the author of a story he had never read. I began to walk forward, my steps measured and unhurried. My protectors flanked me, a silent, imposing presence, but it was not them that held the crowd captive. It was me. I kept my gaze fixed on my son, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking second, I saw the little boy again, the one with tears streaming down his face, clutching a doorway. Then he was gone, replaced by the man who had called me to humiliate me. I did not break eye contact as I crossed the threshold into his perfectly curated world. The string quartet faltered, the laughter died, and the only sound was the resonant click of my heels on the stone. The wretched woman had arrived. And Damian's carefully constructed stage had just begun to crumble. The reception was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The air buzzed with frantic whispers, a current of speculation that ran beneath the forced cheerfulness of the music. Every move I made was tracked by 100 pairs of eyes. I chose a seat at a table near the back, a silent observer at my own tribunal, but they would not let me remain silent. Howard's sister, emboldened by 2 glasses of champagne, rose to give an impromptu toast. "We are all so proud of Damian," she began, her voice dripping with condescending magnanimity as she gestured toward me. "So proud that he has the grace and forgiveness in his heart to invite his mother to share this day. It takes a truly special man to rise above the past." The implication was clear. I was the past. I was the sinner. He was the saint for allowing me, the penitent, into his presence. I felt the curious glances of the other guests, waiting to see if I would shrink under the weight of her words. I did not shrink. I rose. Slowly, I placed my napkin on the table and picked up my water glass. The room fell silent. "A toast," I said, my voice calm, clear, and amplified by the sudden stillness. "To my son Damian and his beautiful bride Vanessa." I paused, letting the polite sentiment settle before I continued. "You have heard me called the Wretched Woman. You have been told a story of a mother who abandoned her child for greed. For 20 years, I have carried the weight of that story in silence. But tonight, I will offer you the truth." Gasps rippled through the room. I looked directly at Damian, whose face was now a rigid mask of fury. I did not abandon my son. I was taken from him. I was taken from my home in handcuffs while my 5-year-old boy cried for me in a doorway. And the people who should have defended me, the people who knew the truth, stood silent while lies buried my name. But they did not bury me. I survived prison. I survived poverty. I scrubbed floors, and I studied by library light. And brick by brick, I built my life again. Not in shame but in dignity. Not from the ashes, but from the fire itself. I stand here tonight not to ask for forgiveness but to state a fact. The truth, no matter how long it is buried, will always find its way into the light. My toast is this: may your marriage be built on a foundation of truth, Damian. Because a house built on lies will inevitably collapse under its own weight. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water and sat back down. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than any I had ever known. Then Damian exploded. He shot up from his chair, his face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. "You ruin everything!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You come here to my wedding and you ruin everything!" He pointed a trembling finger at me, his whole body shaking. "You abandoned me. You are nothing." Howard tried to grab his arm, to quiet him, but Damian shoved him away. The more he shouted, the smaller and more pathetic he seemed. His rage didn't expose me. It exposed him. All his carefully constructed artifice was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly tantrum of a boy who had been caught in a lie. Vanessa, his bride, stared at him, her face a pale mask of horror, as if seeing the man beside her for the very first time. I remained perfectly still, an island of calm in the hurricane of his making. The contrast was stark, and everyone in that room saw it. They saw his unhinged fury, and they saw my unshakable composure, and in that moment they knew. They finally knew who had been telling the truth. I did not stay for the cutting of the cake. My purpose had been served. Before leaving, I requested a final word with Damian. We met in a small private study off the main hall. He stood with his back to me, his shoulders rigid. "I don't hate you, Damian," I said softly, "but I don't love you anymore. The bond between a mother and child is a sacred thing, but it is not unbreakable. It requires truth. It requires respect. Yours was broken by lies, and it died from neglect. You spent your life believing a story that made you a victim. Now you must live with the truth that makes you a fool. I have carried my burdens. I have paid my dues. Whatever you carry from this day forward, that is yours alone to bear." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I walked out of that venue, flanked by my protectors, and stepped into the cool night air. The silver Ghost was waiting, its engine humming softly. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt only a profound and final sense of release. The chains were broken. They had called me wretched, and perhaps for a time I was. I was wretched with grief, wretched with injustice, wretched with loneliness. But I had taken that name, that brand of their making, and I had reforged it. Success was my revenge. Dignity was my victory. The woman who drove away that night was not the wretched woman. She was just Claudette. And for the first time in a very long time, that was more than enough. She was free.